In this section, we're going to talk about basic operational procedures with the AF100. This will be old hat to many people. If it's your first opportunity to use a professional camera, you may not know some of these things. If you have been using other cameras, maybe the way that I described this, it might open some eyes. You may not have recognized that the camera is capable of some of the things that it is. So I'm just going to go through the basic operation of the camera. First thing we're going to talk about is, believe it or not, getting exposure. Getting exposure is something that people seem to think, hey, if I just look at the LCD and it looks bright enough, I'm good. I know that that's a common workflow with some other cameras that don't have the exposure tools that this does, like some of your DSLRs and whatnot, but that's not the way you want to go. I mean, first of all, there are many tools in here that help you get a proper exposure. And second of all, relying on the LCD is a gamble, because the LCD, this is not a production quality monitor. This is an on-camera LCD, and you can't really expect too much out of it. Yeah, it's kind of high def. Yeah, it looks pretty good, but I wouldn't bank my whole production on saying, whoa, hey, it looks good on the LCD, we must be good. Let's make sure that it is actually accurate. So in controlling exposure, the main thing we're talking about doing is controlling how much light gets in the camera. And there are many ways that we can control that. The first and most obvious is through the iris. We've got an iris wheel here that works with electronically controlled lenses. And this here is one of the Lumix lenses. Most of the micro four thirds lenses, such as the Olympus or the Lumix, have the ability for electronic iris control. Some don't. For example, I have the Nocton Voigtlander. This doesn't have any electronic control, but it does have an iris ring on it, so you can control exposure by turning the iris ring here. On an electronic lens, we're going to do it on the camera body. On a manual only lens, we're going to do it actually on the iris ring. And if you got a lens that doesn't have an iris ring, and there are some out there, especially some of the newer Nikon and Canon lenses that are made for their APS-C sensors, then you're going to need an adapter, a lens adapter that has its own aperture control. But that's for later. We'll get into that later. Right now, I'm just talking about however you do it, you can control the iris somehow. So the iris is an opening through which light flows. The bigger you make that opening, the more open the hole is, the more light flows through, the brighter your images get. You turn this ring, you can control the direction that you set this with a menu item to whether it's up is open or down is open. A typical broadcaster, if you're used to an ENG camera, down to open is the way that you want to go, because that emulates the way an iris ring works on a broadcast lens. When you're using the iris wheel here, you can adjust the iris on these electronic lenses, the Lumix lenses, or some of the Olympus lenses, or most any lens that's made for micro four thirds mount. However, at least with the Lumix lenses, my experience is the iris control is really slow and kind of clunky and unpleasant. I'm used to working with professional video camera that you have perfectly smooth iris adjustments. Didn't really happen here. It takes too long for the iris to catch up. These lenses, even the ones that are made for video here, iris adjustment isn't very quick, so got to be aware of that. Now, if you're dealing with a still camera lens, something like the Voigtlander here, the iris, you can change it as quick as you want to. There's hard stops in the iris, and that's not really what you want for video. Then again, remember, these aren't video lenses, these are still lenses, so, as you're adjusting the iris, that's not all that fun. A real cinema lens that is designed to be adjusted during a shot is a smooth process. The iris changes with no fixed stops. It's continuously variable from wide open to close. There are markings for what iris you're at, but there's not a hard stop there. So if you need that, that's one reason why cinema lenses are more expensive. You get this wonderful iris ring that has infinite adjustability. Still lenses, usually not going to find that. You can, however, get some lenses like the Zeiss ZFs. There's a company called Duclos Lenses, DUCLOS lenses.com, and they do a cinema modification on these kind of lenses. They'll put geared rings on here, because like with a cinema lens, you've got a geared focus ring and a geared iris ring, and if it was a zoom, it would have a geared zoom ring that are made to work with a follow focus. With a still lens, you don't typically have that, but if you get the Cinemod, Matt Duclos puts the gear ring on there. He puts a common size front on here, and he also declicks the iris, so you get that wonderful smooth iris control. If you want to be able to do remote iris control, let's say you're stuck up on top of a jib arm, or you're way out at the end of a crane or something like that, and you need to be able to control exposure, you can get something like this. Well, any remote focus iris controller from a DVX100 or an HVX200, HVX170, HMC150, they'll all work. The AF100 has a remote control port here on the back that will take two remotes. It'll take one for focus and iris and one for start-stop recording. Now on the DVX100 and those other cameras, they actually also have remote zoom control. AF100 doesn't have zoom motors, so there's never going to be a zoom, so it doesn't have that. But the idea is if you want to control iris remotely, you can. This is the Foxy. It's pretty nice. It emulates the look and feel of a regular follow focus, but in a remote and electronic form. So if you're using something like one of the Lumix lenses here, you can't really use a mechanical follow focus with something like this, but you can use the electronic remote, and this will control focus and iris remotely. It doesn't really give you any better iris performance than you get off of the wheel, but at least you can do it from a distance, and it's another way that you can remotely control the camera's exposure capability on these electronic lenses. So you control the iris. You also control the amount of light that comes in the camera through the neutral density filter. And the neutral density filter is a great thing because this gives you the ability to control your iris in many different lighting conditions. You can get, I've actually had in outdoors in broad daylight, I can get between f2 and f22. I can choose any iris in that situation by using the neutral density filter. The neutral density filter up here, you've got 4 positions. In position 1, it is actually totally clear. There's no filters at all. So you've got 2, 3, and 4. Each of those positions is labeled here with this little patch that shows you what strength of neutral density filter you're using. So I'm going to pull the lens off and show you how that neutral density filter actually works. There is a physical wheel in there with different filters on it. That's clear. When I go to position 2, it's darker. It's like sunglasses for your camera. It's cutting the amount of light that comes in. And that's a 2-stop filter. Position 1, this is like an ND 0.6 or a 2-stop filter, and on the banner here it'll say that it cuts the light to 1/4, or on the LCD it will refer to it as ND 1/4 because it's telling you that it's cutting the light that's coming in by 2 full f-stops or to 1/4 of its brightness. Then we can go to the next position, position 3. That's darker still, and that's cutting another 2 stops of light out. So that's basically an ND 1.2. And then you go to position 4, that's cutting another 2 stops of light out. So now we have a total of 6 stops of light that are being cut out. That's significant darkening, and now in this position you can get the iris almost fully open even in broad daylight. On position 1, no filtration whatsoever. Obviously indoors, that's where you're going to want to be almost all the time. The other positions are for outdoors and for controlling just where you want your iris to be able to be. So the iris in connection with the ND filter lets you control the amount of light that's entering the camera and hitting the sensor. There's another way you control exposure, which is through the shutter speed, but you don't really want to. I'm going to lay that out there right for you. Shutter is not really a good way to control exposure. It is a way that you could do it, but I don't really want you to. A number of reasons why, but let's just reference that, first of all, in still photography, shutter is a totally valid way to control exposure, and still photographers do it all the time. And people coming from still photography and using a DSLR, you know, they'll reach for the shutter and go changing that. You don't want to do that because when you change the shutter, it changes the amount of motion blur that's in your shot. We are accustomed as viewers to seeing a certain level of motion blur. We're accustomed to that through 60 years of video work and through 110 years of film work. We know what a shot is supposed to look like. We know what the blur should be in motion. And normally when you're using this camera, if you set the shutter at default or at, in the USA or NTSC territories, 1/60th of a second, you're going to get basically that motion blur. And if you're in a PAL territory, Europe, 1/50th of a second, which is the same as shutter off, is where you want to be. If you do want to change the shutter, you do so through the back of the camera here. There is the shutter frame rate button, and there's the actual shutter dial that lets you control what that is. So you choose the dial select here, and you press that button until it brings up dial shutter. And then you use this wheel, you push it in or out to turn the shutter on or off. So it's a wheel, but it's also a button. And when the shutter is off like that, kind of full-size broadcast camera, shutter off means there is no shutter. And so it's full exposure the entire time of your frame rate. So at 24p, you would be getting a shutter of 1/24th of a second on a full 2/3 inch broadcast camera. That's not how it works on the Panasonic AG series. When you turn the shutter off, what it really means is you get a default shutter speed. And the default shutter speed depends on what frame rate you're in. If you're in 720 60p or 1080 60i, it will be 1/60th of a second. If you're in any other mode, 24p, 25p, 30p, 50p, 50i, any of those, then the default will be 1/50th of a second, which can cause problems. We'll talk about that in just a second. So you set the shutter to on, and the actual shutter rate will show up here if you have the other display set to all, which I always recommend. So you turn in the menus, which we'll talk about in the menu section, you turn off the other display to all, and then you can see all the individual settings, and then you can just rotate through the shutter speeds. The default shutter speed is set so that it is in shorter duration than your frame rate is. The frame rate is the number of frames per second that the camera is creating. And for film style work, you normally want 24 frames per second. That's what film runs at. For a live image, something that looks like reality, sports, news, those type of things, you would normally use 60 frames per second, or in PAL territory, 50 frames per second. You could have a shutter speed that's actually slower than your frame rate if you're in video camera mode, but the camera doesn't allow you to violate the laws of physics, so you have to kind of understand what happens when you choose that. If I go in video camera mode and I choose a shutter speed of 1/6 of a second, and I'm shooting 24 frames per second, I will only actually get 6 individual frames created. What the camera will actually do is it will duplicate frames. What I'll actually get is effectively 6 frames per second. So when you're setting your shutter speed, you don't want to set your shutter speed slower than your frame rate unless you are looking for a specific slow motion effect. So for example, if you're shooting 720 60p, never set it on 1/30th of a second, or what will end up happening is you'll actually get effectively 30p. So you control the amount of light, the quantity of light through the iris, and you control the duration of how long the light hits the sensor through the shutter. So both of those are a way to control how much light gets to the sensor. And the neutral density filter, again, that's like sunglasses. That darkens the amount of light. It prohibits a certain amount of light from hitting the sensor. So between those 3 things, that's how you determine your exposure. And at least 2 of them have side effects that you want to be aware of. The one, shutter speed, we've already talked about. The faster you make the shutter, the choppier your motion will be, the less realistic it will look. A very fast shutter speed might be appropriate for something like, it's currently in vogue for high action sequences. It really started with Saving Private Ryan, storming the beach scene, and everything that was shown in action is very choppy and staccato. That's because they used a very short shutter speed. And, you know, for zombie movies like 28 Days Later, they've been using that. So that's a valid use of that, but it's a specific look. And unless you're going for that specific look, stay away from changing the shutter speed. Leave it on the 1/60th for NTSC territories or 1/50th for PAL territories. The iris, if you change the iris, that has side effects too, and that's related to the depth of field of your shot. We'll talk about that in another section a little bit more, but basically the amount of your shot that's in focus. The more open the iris is, the narrower that range is. So if you're using a very open iris lens, like the f0.95, or like with my compact prime here, it's a f1.4, you open that all the way up to f1.4, you'll have a very narrow, shallow depth of field. So maybe if you're doing a headshot with that, you might have the person's nose to their ears in focus, everything else is out of focus. And if you're using a long, shallow depth of field lens, you might end up with their eyes in focus and nothing else in focus. That's if you open the lens all the way up. If you stop the lens down, you're cutting the amount of light that comes in, but you're also making that depth of field deeper. So more will be in focus. So if you're trying to shoot something where there's a lot of action and motion, that's very, very difficult to do if the iris is all the way open. So you stop it down some, and now you can get more of the action in focus. So if you're shooting a sporting event, a football game, or you're just doing a wide shot and you don't want everything out of focus, you want some depth in there, by stopping the lens down, you can get that. So those are 2 side effects that come with using the iris or the shutter for controlling exposure. There's yet another way that you can basically control exposure. It doesn't control the amount of light that comes in, but it controls how bright the images are that you record, and that's through changing the ISO or gain. Now you got a switch here. The gain switch has got 3 positions, low, medium, and high. Where I've got this set on the low gain position, I've got it at ISO 200. Let's go ahead and go up there. The gain is ISO 200, middle position 400, and bottom position 1600. You can change that in a third of a stop increments, anywhere from 200 up to 3200. The smaller the number is, the less sensitive the camera is, and the more light you will need. Now, sometimes that's a really good thing. Sometimes if you're shooting outdoors or whatever and you have a ton of light and you can't stop the iris down enough, use the gain here. turn that to ISO 200, and that will cut the amount of light that the sensor is recognizing. Now, again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to balance the amount of light that's hitting the sensors. Gain doesn't really change the amount of light. It just changes the amount of amplification that the image does. It can electronically brighten the image up or darken it down. So it doesn't truly change the amount of light. You change the light with the neutral density filters, the iris, and the shutter. The gain changes the camera's inherent sensitivity. As a general rule of thumb, you normally want to have the gain as low as you can have it and still get your shot. The higher you set the gain, the noisier the image gets. There's never going to be a free lunch. Hey, ISO 3200, that's 10 times more sensitive than ISO 320, right? You need 1/10 as much light, right? Yes, but it's also grainier and noisier and muddier. So you don't want to rely on ISO 3200. You always want to have light instead. If you're in a situation where there just isn't enough light, yeah, you can reach for the gain. And the gain also comes in handy if you got too much light. The normal rating of the camera is ISO 400. That's what Panasonic considers the ideal trade-off of sensitivity and noise and everything else. They've rated it at 400. But you can go down to 200. And when you cut that number in half, that ISO number in half, you're cutting in half the general sensitivity of the camera. So it will take twice as much light at ISO 200 to get the same brightness as you had at ISO 400. And it will take half as much light at ISO 800 than it takes at ISO 400. And all the numbers work that way. So if you have a shutter of 1/120th, that means it will require twice as much light to get the same brightness as a shutter of 1/60th. The one that isn't exactly linear is the iris. You can see doubling in the numbers. You can go from iris 2 to iris 4, f2 to f4, but that doesn't cut the amount of light in half. That cuts the amount of light in a fourth. So you got to be a little bit more careful with that. One f-stop down from f2 would be f2.8, and that will cut the amount of light in half. So in those three ways, you can change the amount of light coming in the camera. You can double it or half it by either doubling or halving the ISO, doubling or halving the shutter speed, or changing the iris by one f-stop. And one f-stop amount of light is basically twice as much as the prior f-stop, or half as much as the next f-stop. All of this in combination lets us control the amount of light coming in the camera, and that's key to getting a good exposure. But how do you know what the right amount is? Well, there's a lot of tools in here that will help you tell that. There are two situations you can get yourself in. Well, three situations. You can have proper exposure, you can have underexposure, or you can have overexposure. Proper exposure, obviously, just by naming, that's what you want. Underexposure is to be avoided. It's horrible. It's when there's not enough light and your iris is too stopped down and everything is very grainy and muddy and dark and ugly. Overexposure, on the other hand, is worse, because in overexposure, everything's too bright, and you'll actually have items that are burning out to white. If you go out and you overexpose the sky, you'll get this horrible, ugly field of just nasty white that doesn't look good, doesn't look appealing to anybody. You want to avoid that. So you have to control the amount of light that's coming in. You have to make sure you're not overexposing or underexposing your subject. You want to go for proper exposure. If you've got a situation where you just cannot get both items in, let's say you have a person with a bright sky behind them, maybe the person's face is too dark and the sky is too bright. Now you got to balance lighting. This is where you bring in a reflector to reflect some more light on your subject to get them up bright enough. Or maybe you change your shot and you put something other than the bright sky behind them so that you can get a proper balance of exposure. So watch what's too hot and watch what's too dark and try to avoid that. Keep things nice in the middle where they belong and you'll get great results. But if you let things go blowing out or you let them crush off the bottom as too dark, then you're just going to end up complaining, because that's not what the camera does. Camera is a light gathering device. Feed it and it will reward you. Starve it and you're not going to like the results. So how do we know what's bright enough or what's too dark? Many different ways to know what the relative brightness is. One way is just by looking at the LCD. As I've already told you, that's a terrible way to do it because it's very subjective, and it also depends on the LCD brightness level. You can go in here and you can change the LCD backlight level and the brightness level, and you can brighten this up or darken it down. And all of that would be misleading because you're not changing the image that the camera's capturing. You're just changing the way this displays. And so if it looks too dark on here, you might brighten it up and then be overexposing in the camera, but now it looks okay on the LCD. That's a disaster. Don't do that. Don't rely on the LCD's brightness level alone to tell you what good exposure is. Use the actual tools that are in there. There are a number of tools. The first one we're going to talk about is the zebras. Inside the LCD panel, you have this zebra button. This zebra button has got Three positions actually. There's zebra 1, zebra 2, and the marker. Marker we're not going to worry too much about for this section here. It's kind of like a spot meter. If you know what a spot meter is, you know what the marker is. But zebra 1 and zebra 2, when you press the button, it will toggle between the various zebra settings. The zebras will toggle through between zebra 1, zebra 2, and the marker, and off. I pretty much say leave the zebras on at all times because you always want to know when something's too bright. Now, how do the zebras work? Basically, to understand the zebras, you got to understand how brightness is measured in the IRE scale. You don't necessarily need to know that it's IRE, but basically 0 to 105 is what we really need to know about. And you can think about it as a percentage of brightness. When something's at 100%, it's pretty much pure white. When something's at 0, that's pretty much pure black. It doesn't matter what it looks like in the real world, it matters what it looks like to the camera. So if your sky is a beautiful, lovely blue, and you expose it so that it's at 105%, it's not blue anymore. Now it'll be a burned out white because it's what the camera thinks, it's what its range is what its brightness level is what really matters. So you want to track that and know what the brightness level is of what you're shooting at. There are as many opinions on what your zebra should be set at as there are cameramen. Everybody has their own preference. You'll develop your own preference. I'll just tell you where I'm coming from. Basically, I like to have zebra 1 set at 70%. And 70%, when you're looking at various skin tones, usually for proper exposure, for a good looking image, for healthy skin tones with no clipping on a Caucasian person, 70 is about as high as you normally ever want to go. So when you set your zebras at 70 and you're setting your iris to set your exposure, you should just barely begin to see zebras at the very hottest points on a Caucasian person's skin. Now obviously if you're dealing with a darker skin tone, that highlight point will happen a little bit lower. So maybe for an Indian skin tone here, or Hispanic or whatever, maybe we're looking at 60. You know, maybe for an African American, maybe 50, 55, whatever you like, whatever looks good to you. But the limit, usually, when you're dealing with Caucasian skin, is about 70. So you'd open up the iris until that zebras just start showing up on the very hottest spots, which will be the reflective parts. The light is hitting you and bouncing off your forehead or the bridge of your nose or something like that, maybe a cheekbone. You just start seeing the zebras at 70 there. And that will usually tell you, okay, you've got a good, healthy, robust exposure for that skin tone. You don't want to go overexposing skin, because when you do, it'll start turning yellow. Each individual component of the color, the red, green, and blue, is sampled separately, and in skin, red is a brighter component than the others. So if you start overexposing, the red might clip before the green and the blue do, and that means you'll be bringing in more green and blue. What do green and blue together create? Yellow. So if you start seeing yellow skin tones, that's a good indication that you're probably overexposing your skin and you should back down a little bit. So you set your skin tones at 70, and then the other zebra, I normally set it about 100. You can go to 105 if you want. I normally set it about 100, and the goal here is to never see zebras at 100. So I set it on 70, line up, get my exposure on my faces, pop over to zebra 2, 100, or maybe even 105, and I don't want to see any zebras at all. Because if there's no zebras anywhere, that means nothing's clipping, nothing's overexposing. I've probably got a pretty decent exposure at that point. If the skin looks good, if the person looks good, and there's nothing blown out, that's great. Now, sometimes you'll have circumstances that will be blowing out. Let's say you have a shot with an interview and there's a light fixture behind them. Maybe we'll let that light bulb blow out if the rest of the scene looks good. But you don't normally want to let that blow out. You know, you want to use a dimmer or something to bring that back in exposure because blowout's just ugly. But maybe you're doing a shot outdoors and there's someone standing next to a car and there's a reflection of the sun in the bumper, you know, chrome bumper. Okay, that's going to blow out. There's nothing I care about that. I mean, that's going to look fine. But if your sky is blowing out, if your sky shows up at 100 or 105 zebras, you got trouble and you want to change that. A few ways you can change that. Probably the easiest way is if you can recompose your shot so that the sun is at your back. That's the simplest way to do it, because if the sun's at your back, it's in your subject's face and it just looks much better. But if you have to shoot the other way, maybe you have to bring up the light on your subject. Maybe you have to stop down the iris and let the subject go darker. It's up to you how you want to do it, but ideally you would avoid overexposure. The second way that you can tell exposure is if we go on the marker and it comes up and says marker on, then you get this little box. And in that little box, it will tell you what the brightness is of whatever you're pointing at over here. So we've got a percent here that says 2%. That's because the lens cap is on and it's black. But we'll show some examples here that as you pan around with the marker, you can see exactly what the brightness level within that box is. So that will let you know what the skin tone is exactly, or what the highlights are, or what the green screen is in the background. You can tell with that little marker. So it's like using a spot meter, if you're used to using a light meter, where you can focus in on just one little section and tell exactly what that brightness is. On prior cameras, the marker was very handy. On this camera, I don't really bother because there's a much better tool, and that is found with the WFM button. You turn the waveform on. And the waveform monitor tells you everything about your image. When you look at the waveform monitor, it will tell you the brightness of your image on a left to right basis. So it's representing the image left to right. And the higher that line goes on the waveform monitor, the brighter the image is. There are gradated lines there. The heavy line in the center is 50. That's 50 IRE. You got a 100 line up at the top and a 0 line down at the bottom, and then the dashed lines at every 10 IRE in between. So you can, at a glance, you can tell, okay, this is 60 IRE here, that's 40 IRE here. IRE is the Institute of Radio Engineers, and it's how we measure brightness on a scale of basically 0 is pure black, 100 is pure white. It can go above that. It can go to 105 or even actually up to 109. But when you do that, like I mentioned before, you run into a real danger of your highlights turning different colors on you because one or the other of those channels might clip. So you might see yellow highlights in your clouds or yellow highlights on the skin or whatever when you start messing with getting up much above 100. So I don't really recommend doing that. What the waveform monitor does, it lets you know at a glance exactly what your image looks like. And if you have trouble spots, where those are. If something is too bright and it's clipping off the top and you can see that, oh, that's about 15% of the way across the screen, look through the viewfinder, look at what there is. Oh, look, there's a light bulb or a reflection on glass or something like that. That lets you know and identify exactly where that is. And if you see the waveform all bunched down at the bottom, like in this shot here, that's not a good shot. If you see that happening, what you're going to record is ugly, muddy mess. And you know that right off the bat. I don't care if it looks good in the LCD. When you get it in the edit bay, you're going to hate what you got. So definitely you want a full, rich, saturated waveform where appropriate. If you have a lot of dark elements in the shot, obviously those elements are going to be reflected in the darker range. But normally you want to go with some measure of balance. People think about, low light shooting if they want to shoot at night. They want to shoot everything very dark. You don't really do that. You actually, when you're shooting a night shot, you shoot with basically the same level of exposure on your subjects as you would do in a daytime shot. It just looks like night because the background is all dark, sure. But the actual subject should probably be lit about as much. Maybe not quite as much, but about as much. So you still need adequate light for exposure. So using the various tools that we've got, which include the waveform monitor, the zebras, actually looking at the LCD or at an actual production monitor, you can tell what your exposure is mathematically. This removes subjectivity from the case and lets you know mathematically, yes, I have a good exposure, or no, that is not a good exposure. If you look through the LCD and you say, whoa, everything looks too dark, so you open up the iris and the zebras start popping up, the 100 zebras start popping up, believe the zebras. Don't believe what the LCD is looking like. Believe the zebras. If the zebras are up there at 100, you got trouble and you're overexposed. Back off. If your zebras tell you that your skin tone's at 70, believe it. If it looks too dark on the LCD, okay, too bad. The LCD loses. Believe the mathematics because those are objectively right. They're absolutely going to give you the best exposure. Getting exposure on the AF100 is pretty important. It's got a decent range, got about 10.5 stops of dynamic range, but you don't want to go relying on that. You want to get the exposure, nail it right in camera as best you can, and using all these various tools will help you to do that. Now let's talk about focusing. Well, that should be easy, right? I mean, who doesn't know how to focus? You turn this ring here and things are in focus. Yeah, but there's a lot more to it than that, and especially with the AF100, there's some things you need to know about it or some techniques that we've developed that make it a lot easier to make sure your shots are in focus. One thing being that it's a shallow depth of field camcorder, and so compared to some cameras you may have used, a lot less will be in focus. That makes getting proper focus a lot more critical. So we'll talk about some of those techniques. First thing we're going to mention is autofocus. Some of you are rolling your eyes. Who does autofocus? That's not professional. Well, some of you do it. Some of you need it. So we're going to talk about what the capabilities are. There is a button on there or a switch that goes up to A for autofocus. With some lenses, that's possible. Now, if you're dealing with a truly manual lens, it's not going to happen. If there's nothing in the lens to control focus, you're not going to get automatic focus, obviously. But sometimes people come into this camera new or from other systems, they may not know that. So stills camera lenses, autofocusing is not that good. If you're using a still camera lens, if you're using a Nikon or a Canon or Samyang or Tamron or whatever, autofocus on these type of lenses is made for still camera focusing, not made for video. How does a still camera focus? Think about it. You press the button down, it goes, and then it locks in. Do you really want that happening during your video? That's not how a video camera focuses. So if you're using still camera lenses, autofocus is not going to be all that useful. And some lenses that say that they're autofocus or have autofocus in them won't autofocus in true AF mode. So there's a second thing you can do here. This is the push auto button right here. And when you press and hold that down, that will let some of these lenses that can't do full autofocus, that will let them focus while you're holding the button down. An example of that would be this here. This is the pretty famous and very, very nice little lens. This is a Lumix 20mm pancake. Really sharp, very tiny. It can autofocus, but not full autofocus. It can only do it when you're holding the manual push auto button down. It's also a little bit noisy. It makes a little bit of a grinding noise. If you want real autofocus, you pretty much only have one choice. If you need this camera to act like an autofocusing video camera, then as of the time that I'm making this disc, this is really the only choice. This is the Lumix 14-140 lens. It has a silent video style, no breathing autofocus mode, just like a video camera does. If you're used to working with a video camera's autofocus and you need that on an AF100, this is pretty much, as of this time, the only game in town. New lenses may be developed. I don't know of any on the drawing board at this point, but if they do, they'll have this little HD red logo on there. So you'll see that on this Lumix, it doesn't say that anywhere. Well, this one doesn't have HD video autofocus, but this one does. So if you use this lens in combination with this camera, you put it in autofocus, hey, you're going to get autofocus, and it's not bad. It's pretty decent for autofocus. Something to keep in mind is that the slower your frame rate, the slower your autofocus performance is going to be. Don't expect good solid performance in 24p. The frame rate is too slow, the focus has to hunt, it's not really very good. But if you put it in 60p or 60i, you can get pretty decent autofocus. If you're using something like maybe one of the Olympus 4/3 lenses on a 4/3 to micro 4/3 adapter, yeah, they're clicky and they're noisy and the focus is really slow and you have to hold down the button. So evaluate what you need. If you need true video autofocus, you're probably not going to get that with the stills camera lens. You need a lens that's designed to do that purpose. Also, there are some things you can do that will disable the ability for all autofocus. So just be aware of that. For example, if you turn on variable frame rate mode, if you're over cranking or under cranking, you're doing some slow motion work or something like that, autofocus becomes disabled. This is mainly a digital cinema and professional video camera, and it's not really built to do ENG or event style coverage. You can do it if you work around it, but just be aware that there are some workarounds. What else is there? Obviously, there's manual focus. When you go into manual focus mode, there are a number of focus assist aids that you can use that will help you to get proper focus. One of them is down here in this lower right corner, you'll see the little letters MF, or, if you have the auto manual switch up in automatic mode, it'll say AF if you have an autofocusing lens. If you don't have an autofocusing lens, you have a manual only lens, it'll still say MF. MF stands for manual focus, AF autofocus. And what they'll tell you is they'll tell you the distance that you're focusing at. So this is one simple way you can spot check exactly where you are. You can say, the subject's about 10 feet away, so if I spin the focus ring to 10 feet, it's a gauge. It's reasonably accurate. It's not really something that I would use a tape measure for and tell exactly the distance, but it's pretty close. And if you're stopped down a little bit, f2.8 or f4, it's probably plenty close enough that you'll get accurate focus if you're measuring by distance. A second thing that you can use in the lower left corner is what we call the focus bar. The focus bar is designed so that as more and more of the image comes in focus, the longer and longer that bar will get. And when you go too far and you're starting to focus past what your image is, then the bar will start getting shorter and shorter. So obviously you want to tweak that focus ring until you get the bar exactly as long as it can be. This works great if you're shooting something that's flat. If you're shooting a res chart, something like that, something that's on a flat image, or you're shooting a book or something, it's perfect for that. But if you're shooting a scene with a lot of depth, the focus bar isn't that helpful because it doesn't necessarily know what it is that you want to be in focus. It'll tell you that more and more of the scene is in focus, but it doesn't necessarily know how to prioritize what you want to have in focus. There's a third focus assist, and this is one that you can assign to a user button, and by factory default, it comes up on the user 1. And when you press that, you get this red border around the screen. And this is the focus in red assist. And what this will do is this will find anything in the image that it believes is really sharply, crisply focused, and it'll add a red outline around it, which can be great because then as you're racking through a shallow depth of field shot, the red will move through the scene until it gets on what you want. And then you know that, okay, you focused on exactly what you want. So if you're shooting something and you have a human subject in there, normally what you want to focus on is their eyes. So you turn this focus ring with the focus in red on until you get a red outline on whatever lights are in their eyes. And then you know you've got picture perfect pinpoint focus. Now, sometimes the focus in red doesn't work. And that will happen if there's not enough contrast in a shot. If it doesn't see sharp edges, because it focuses on sharp edges and high contrast transitions, high contrast being, from black to white or from, very dark gray to very light gray, whatever, it needs to see an edge in order for it to draw an outline around that. If it doesn't see one, it won't show up. So if you have a face with no highlights on it, it would really struggle to find something to outline in red. So what I recommend doing in cases like that is in cinematography, it's usually a good practice to have a catch light, a reflection of a light in someone's eyes because it brings life to the shot. And that catch light is very simple for the focus in red to latch onto. If in your setup you don't have that, bring a little flashlight along. Just a little mag light or something like that. Bam, light up their eyes for a second, or have somebody who's standing near them bounce a reflection off their eyes. Use that to focus in. When the red lights up, bam, you've got it exactly there. A second thing you can do, which is very helpful with the focus in red, is you can turn the viewfinder black and white. And you can actually do it with the LCD too, but you probably don't want to do it with both of them. I've been doing it with the viewfinder. The viewfinder is sharper. It has more pixels than the LCD, so I find that for focusing, this is a great way to go. Turn the viewfinder display to black and white. You go into the display menu and you change EVF color to off. When that's black and white, and then you turn the focus in red on, the red will still show up. So now the only time you'll see color at all is on the very sharply focused, tightest pinpoint of where actual focus is, so it makes it a breeze to be able to get perfect pinpoint focus. The AF100 does not offer a magnified focus assist. All the prior Panasonic AG series have had it. This one doesn't. Don't necessarily know why. All I can tell you is it's not there. Don't go looking for it. You'll be frustrated because you won't find it. So you have to make do with something like the focus in red or distance measurement. It does have a focus hook that you can put a tape measure on at the mark of where the sensor is. So if you're using a lens that is properly collimated, that has accurate focus marks, something like a dedicated cinema lens that has markings. If you look how frequently the markings are, I got a position here for 22 inches, and then here's for 23 inches, and here's for 2 feet. So you can draw a tape measure from the hook out to your subject, and if it's exactly 3 foot 6 inches away, then you can turn to the focus mark here and spin to 3 foot 6. And as long as your lens is properly collimated to the camera body, you're gold. That's a great way to go, and you can double check with the focus in red. Some people don't want to turn their viewfinder black and white. Sometimes they turn the LCD black and white because they like to use the waveform monitor. So they use the viewfinder for viewing and the LCD monitor for focusing and for the waveform display. So that's another way to go. There's not a on-off for the color on the LCD panel, but you can go in and change the LCD color down in 16 steps. And if you set it all the way down to the bottom, it will be pure black and white. So when you're in the situation of trying to focus on this camera, if you have a perfectly collimated mount, you can use the distance. If you have a real autofocusing lens, you can use autofocus. For most of us, for most of what we're doing, if you're using a cinema lens or something that doesn't have those capabilities, the focus in red is the main focus assist tool. And if you use it properly and you learn to recognize where the red is and you use a catch light in someone's eyes, you'll get it every time. If you don't like the red and you want to use regular peaking, focus in red is a kind of a peaking. The AF100 also offers a EVF detail button in here. And what that does is the same as the focus in red, but it's in white. So it adds a white outline around everything that's in sharp focus. And sometimes I guess it's kind of difficult for people to really see the effect or be able to discern what it is. So here's what I recommend you doing. Get a sharply focused shot and then just turn that on and off Play with that for a little bit. You'll learn to recognize it. When you know what you're looking for, you turn the EVF detail on, and then you go to focus a shot. When something goes from out of focus to in focus, it's really night and day. It's like, bam, it gets this white edge around everything, and you can really crisply see it. The only thing about EVF detail, one reason that I talk about the red more, is EVF detail is more generous with what it thinks is in focus. And that makes it easier to see it. It makes it easier to notice that, oh, the EVF detail has come on. But I'm not so sold on that. I want the most critical, only the most critical in-focus items to represent that they are in focus. And so the focus in red is extremely picky. You can actually use them both in combination. Problem is, I'm not so sure it's all that accurate. I think it's too generous. So I would caution you against doing that. If you're in a situation where you want to do run and gun with full color, EVF detail is great for that. You put EVF detail on the outboard LCD, and it's really easy to get a good, sharp, proper focus, especially if you stop down just a little bit. So you got, you're not running at f0.95, but you're running, maybe f4. Then you'll have a deep enough depth of field that when the EVF detail shows up, you're going to be in focus. That's going to be great. But if you want pinpoint precision and to know for absolutely a fact that something is truly in focus, the focus in red is great for that because it will tell you only the very sharpest items that are in focus. One more operational aspect to talk about is white balance. White balance is a very simple process. Most people understand it. We're going to talk about a couple of things about white balance on here because I think there are some things that you would want to know about. First of all, not all light is the same color. You can be shooting under daylight, you can be shooting under tungsten, you can be shooting into mixed lighting conditions, and you have to tell the camera what white is so that it knows and it will render color accurately. There are a number of ways you can do that. I have an actual, this is great by the way, this is the DSC Labs cam book. It's got all sorts of great charts in it. But it has a pure white. Now, you don't have to have a pure white. I mean, we've done plenty of scenarios where we point the camera at a crew member who's wearing a white t-shirt. But the purer the white, the more accurate results are going to be. So, a typical white balance procedure, you want to put the white in the scene being hit by the light that is lighting your subject. You don't want to march this over to the camera and just hold it up in front of the camera and hold up a flashlight and white balance, because then you're white balancing to the flashlight. You're not white balancing to the real light that's in the scene. So bring it up, ideally, if your actor or your talent is comfortable with it, just bam, right in front of their face, and take a white balance by holding down the AWB button on the front of the camera. Now, it's got a number of different ways that it can perform. You can do manual white balance, like what we're talking about now, based on the position of the white balance switch. There's presets A and B. You can do automatic white balancing where it tracks automatically and updates itself, which is okay during mixed lighting conditions. If you're going from outdoors to indoors and you don't have time to set up a white balance card, maybe automatic tracking white balance is okay, but for the most part, you don't want to really rely on any auto feature because inherently it can change on you with or without your permission. White balance is the same way, so be careful with it. And then you also have the presets, and the presets are set for tungsten or daylight. A lot of professional lighting fixtures come in either. A lot of fluorescent fixtures you can get tungsten or daylight. A lot of the new LED lights are actually daylight balanced. So if you know what kind of light you're shooting under, you can choose the preset. Setting the white balance with the preset is about the simplest thing anyone's ever going to do. You set the switch on preset, and then you press the button in front, and it will toggle between the 3.2K, the 5.6K, or the variable. Now, variable is interesting because it lets you actually dial in. If you know exactly what lighting color temperature is, you can adjust it in 100K increments right here. So you choose the variable and then you use the function knob. And as you move the function knob down, you can see the color temperature is going down. As you use it up, the color temperature will go up. The higher the color temperature, the bluer the image will be, the more it's trying to balance towards blue light. The lower that you set it, the oranger it will be. Tungsten light is generally basically orange-ish, daylight is basically bluish, so you're trying to balance towards those. One thing about the presets and the variable though, I think the tungsten preset is spot on, ideal, perfect. If you're shooting under tungsten light, use the tungsten preset, it looks great. But under daylight, there's so many different kinds of daylight lights that I'm not a big fan of using the preset. You might have KinoFlow tubes that are color balanced perfectly for 5600K. That's great. And if that's all you're shooting under, okay, use the preset. But if you're mixing in this light here, this might be 6500K. Or you might have an HMI light with an old bulb, and it might be burning at 8000K. There's so many things that can go wrong with the daylight preset. Actual daylight itself isn't 5600K. It can be anywhere from maybe 3000K at sunrise or sunset up to maybe 10,000K at high noon. So not a big fan of the daylight preset, and I actually find daylight preset is a little purple. It adds a little bit of magenta into the image that I don't care for. So I'll use the tungsten preset, but for daylight, white balance it. Do a manual white balance, get something white and follow it, and that way you'll have accurate color representation. Another thing about white balance, probably the last thing we need to discuss, is the concept of a black balance. When you do a white balance, you're telling the camera what color white is by pointing at something that's white. A black balance is just as important, maybe even more important, especially on these new CMOS sensors, because the black balance, when you tell the camera what black is, it will scan its chip. It shuts light off. It actually has its own shutter in here. So as I hold down the white balance button, it'll do a white balance, and then it does a black balance. And there's actually a physical shutter in there that will shut to make sure that no light hits the sensor. When that shutter is shut, there should be no light whatsoever able to hit the sensor. And so then the camera evaluates, am I seeing pure black? Is there too much noise? If there is, it knows how to deal with that and fine-tune that out. So I recommend doing a black balance frequently. Now, Panasonic recommends in the manual that you should do it if you change from progressive to interlaced, or these various recommendations of when you should do it. I say do it every time you white balance. And you should be white balancing pretty frequently. But always, always do a black balance. All you have to do is hold that button down a little bit longer. Hold it down until it says AWB OK, which means white balance is okay, and then it will say ABB begin, and it's starting a black balance process. So just hold that down, and you'll get much nicer results out of your images. You'll have better, more consistent blacks. You'll have lower noise in the image. It just looks better. You'll have more accurate color representation because you're white balanced, and you'll have better shadow detail and less noise because you're black balanced. In this segment, I want to talk about just one aspect of using the camera that when people are new to 24 frame per second cameras, they get frustrated by. And so I want to attack this head on and explain this a bit so you know what you're looking at. The camera offers a multitude of shooting modes, 1080 in 24p, in 30p or 60i. You got 720 in 24p, 30p or 60p, and you can put it in 50 Hertz mode and get 25p and 50p and 50i. Traditional video cameras, if shot in 50i or 60i, people are used to using those and waving the camera around, and motion is always smooth. Well, then they get something like this, and they think, yeah, now I'm going to make some movies, man. I'm going to make something that looks just like Hollywood. And they take the camera and they put it in 24p mode, and then they go like, why is everything going all... Well, the answer is, because you're doing this. Have you ever seen on a Hollywood set, you ever seen anybody do this? They don't do that. 24 frame per second capture is very slow. And so the way the film works, the shutter opens up and it takes a picture. Then the shutter shuts for a full 48th of a second. If the camera has moved and then the shutter opens up again, the whole image will have shifted over and there will be an abrupt transition. And it's kind of like using a strobe light. If you've ever used motion, you turn on a strobe light and then you do this kind of stuff. Everything is all staccato and choppy. That's because you're only seeing a motion sample from here, and then from here, and then from here. And so it's very jerky and choppy. Film camera will do the same thing. AF100 will do the same thing. So what you want to do is control your motion so that you're not allowing the frames to change too much between frames. And so that means that when you are panning, for example, and you're doing a 90-degree pan from dead forward to 90 degrees, there's a certain amount of time you have to take in order for that to look smooth and good. Now that rate is dependent on how telephoto or wide angle you are. I'm going to use an example of a wide angle lens. If we're using a wide angle lens, wide as we can get, and we want to do a 90-degree pan, and we want it to be smooth without any juddering, do you know how long that takes? According to the American Society of Cinematographers, it should take about 11 seconds. 11 seconds. Let's do that. You see what I'm talking about? That would be smooth. This is not. Ooh, look, I'm getting strobing. Yes, of course you're getting strobing. It's going to happen on any 24p camera. Now, it gets worse when you zoom in. If you zoom in even further, the more that you zoom in, the more the motion is exaggerated. The more the relative motion will appear. So if I'm on full wide angle and I move like this, the subject that I'm looking at may move a little bit in the frame. But if I was in full telephoto and I moved that far, they might whip past the screen. And if they do, they're going to strobe past the screen. So the more telephoto you are, the slower you have to go if you want a smooth pan. So maybe why in the big movies you don't usually see a big panoramic vista where somebody's really slowly panning. We don't necessarily do that kind of shot all that much. What the cinematographers have learned and what you want to do is slow down your pans, and there's actually a table that shows, based on what focal length you're at, how long it will take to do a smooth 90-degree pan. Right now I can hear you saying, I know that I've seen plenty of movies where people are moving the camera a lot faster than that, and I don't see this strobing. Well, A, look at it again, you will see the strobing, but B, you'll see what they're doing. Usually, the cinematographer will have put a subject, they're following a subject. If you're panning past a lot of buildings or something like that, but you're following a car or a subject who's running, and that subject, that car or that person, is relatively stationary in the frame. They're not moving back and forth in the frame. You've lined it up so that they're always here, and then the background's flying by. Your eye will focus on them, not on the background, and they're relatively stationary, so you don't really notice the strobing. Try watching next time you see something like this, look past them to the background, and you'll see it has that same strobing motion. So when you're using something like this, if you want smooth motion, effortless motion, being able to fly the camera around anywhere you want, really that's what 60p, 720 60p or 1080 60i, that's really what that's made for. If you want to be able to get a cinematic look, this strobing is part and parcel of how that look is created. When you're shooting an interview with somebody and you're shooting 24 frames per second, it looks like a movie. It looks beautiful. It looks great. But if you're shooting 60i or 60p, it'll look very live, hyper-realistic. But when you have that hyper-realistic look, then you also have the freedom to move the camera any which way and wherever you want with no strobing issues, because the frame rate is so fast, so little changes between frames that it looks smooth. If you're shooting 24p, you've got to learn camera motion techniques to avoid seeing this stuttery motion. Now, the nice thing about something like an AF100 is, being a video camera, you can look on the LCD and you can see that it's strobing and you can slow down. Another way that you can go is to use what we call the 7-second rule, which I've heard other people say a 6-second rule. I go with 7 because I want it to be just a little bit slower. And that rule says that when you're panning past an object, or when an object is walking past the screen, if you want to be smooth, it should take a solid 7 seconds for that object to cross the screen, or for you to pan past that object. So if you're in a house that has pillars or columns and you're panning past it, count. If it takes less than 7 seconds for that pillar to enter the screen and then cross over and exit the screen, if it's less than 7 seconds, it's probably jittery. If it's taken 7 seconds or more, it's probably smooth. So the thing about the 7-second rule, and why it's easier to remember than the panning rates, is because you don't need to remember what the focal length is. If you're more zoomed in on something, then all motion is magnified, and so you're going to have to know inherently, automatically, oh yeah, I need to slow down, because now in order for it to take 7 seconds to pan past this object, I have to move all that much slower. So that's a way you can remember that. Most of the time, what you really have to do is keep the viewer's eye away from the strobing background and keep them focused on a subject. Some subject who's walking through the scene or running through the scene, or a car that's driving through the scene. And as long as you keep the subject relatively stationary, then the background can strobe as much as it wants, or as much as it's going to, regardless of what you want it to or not. It's going to, and that's whether you shoot on film or on a Red or on an Alexa or whatever else. It's inherent to the way the frame rate works. If you're shooting 24 frames per second, or in PAL 25 progressive frames per second, you're going to have to face this issue, and you're going to have to overcome it with camera work and composition. The AF100's image sensor is an MOS type sensor instead of a CCD. MOS is kind of taken over the camcorder world. It's getting more and more prevalent. And there are some imaging characteristics that are different about MOS chips than there are about CCD chips. Now, if this is your first MOS camcorder, some of this stuff may be new to you. If this is your first MOS camcorder, it's probably not going to be your last, because these chips are becoming very prevalent, very commonplace, and there's just a few things that work differently about them than how film works or how CCD chips worked. So we're going to discuss a few of those because it does make a difference in how you operate the camera or what type of light you shoot under. A CCD chip, like what most professionals are probably used to working with because they're very prevalent in the 2/3 inch shoulder mount camcorders, and basically up until a few years ago they were prevalent in all camcorders. CCD chip exposes its image globally. What I mean by that is the entire frame simultaneously, instantaneously, all is exposed all at once. And that's largely the way that a movie camera works too. CMOS chips don't do that, or MOS type chips, they don't do that. They expose line by line, row by row, down the frame. So it'll start exposing up here, and then it will progressively scan down the frame. It'll finish exposing up here while it's still exposing here. It'll finish here while it's still exposing here. It'll progressively scan down the frame. It's not instantaneous. It takes a little while for it to do that. So depending on how fast your CMOS chip scans or your MOS chip scans, there can be different artifacts exhibited in your video, or different degrees of the same artifacts. And there are several different types of things that will happen on an MOS camcorder that will not happen on a CCD camcorder. The first of which we'll talk about is flash banding. If you're shooting in a situation and an instantaneous flash goes off, you're going to see an artifact in your video where half of your frame, or 2/3 of your frame, or 1/3 of your frame, but a portion of your frame is exposed normally, and the rest of the frame is blown out white. Because as that chip is scanning down, it'll expose normally, and then bam, this flash goes off. All this part of your frame has already been exposed, so the flash won't affect it. This part is still being exposed, and the flash will hit it. So if just one flash goes off, you'll see it looks like a torn image. There's a band of exposed and a band of overexposed. If you're in a situation where you're shooting with a lot of flashes going off, let's say a press conference, a sporting event, a red carpet event, and photographers are just flashing everywhere, you're going to see these bands all over your footage. There's nothing you can do about it. It just is what it is. It's part and parcel of working with an MOS camcorder. People will tell you, hey, change your shutter speed and it'll help. No, it won't. I mean, maybe you'll make the band a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter, but it's going to happen. People are getting kind of used to it. I've seen this footage broadcast from national broadcasters, so people are beginning to accept this artifact. CCD had an artifact too, that if you pointed into a very, very bright light, you would get this vertical smear. The light would be here, but then you'd get this top to bottom smear that would happen. That doesn't happen on MOS chips. But we got used to it. We learned to avoid it, and when we can't avoid it, we just learn that, hey, that's what video looks like. In MOS, we're learning that that's the same thing. When you're in a flashy situation where flashes are going on, that's going to happen. But a second thing that can happen, which is far more objectionable, I think, is what we call skew. Now think about what could happen here. If you're tracking with the camera and there's something vertical there, and as you pan past quickly, as the scanner is scanning down, and your frame is here, and then by the time the scan is moved down, you've moved the camera over here. And as it scans, the camera's here, and then here, and then here. So what are you going to get? It's going to be stretched and angled. So what you really have to watch out for, if you're pointing the camera out the side of a car, or you're driving past and there's a fence behind you, yeah, that fence is going to be angled. It's going to be leaning. Now, fortunately, the AF100 has a pretty quick scanning sensor. It's on par with some of the best CMOS camcorders out there. So the level of skewing is less than you'll get on some others. Like if you're using one of the DSLRs, they'll have maybe twice as much skewing and much more noticeable angles. Here you're going to have some angling, not as much, but it's going to be there. That's not the only way that this can affect you, though. Another way that can affect you is if you happen to be, instead of going side by side, what happens if you go up and down? Well, as the chip is scanning down, if you were to tilt down and the chip is scanning down, you might end up stretching your image out. If you're tilting down at exactly the same rate that it was scanning down, it will see the same image over and over and over, and it will stretch that out. Conversely, if you're tilting up, it'll scrunch down. So now what happens if we combine all this together and you put the camera in a situation where it's subject to vibration and it's going left and right and up and down? You're going to get an effect we call jello, where the image is stretching up and down and is wobbling left and right, and it looks terrible. So basically, I say avoid vibration at all costs. If you're mounting the camera to a car or something like that, you want to have a soft vibration absorbing mount so that it doesn't get bounced around. If you're taking up in a helicopter or something, maybe you're safer hand holding the camera so that your arms will absorb some of the vibration. If you just hard mounted it to the side of something that vibrates, you're going to see a very rubbery image. You kind of want to avoid that. Last thing, and this is probably the worst of the CMOS artifacts because this can sneak up and bite you when you don't expect it. Because the chip scans down at the rate that it scans, under some types of lighting, you will get this ugly scrolling bands artifact. Now, under some types of lighting, you'll have no problem whatsoever. And those are continuous light sources, a light source like the sun. The sun puts out a constant beam of light. It doesn't vary in brightness in any way. And so it doesn't matter how the chip scans because the sun is always constant. For the most part, tungsten lighting will be exactly the same way. I mean, if you got a house with bad wiring, it's possible you'll encounter this artifact if the lights themselves are technically actually flickering. But let's assume that you got a good house, good wiring, good stable electricity, and you've got a stable tungsten light source. It's going to be broadcasting its beam continuously. And so as the chip scans, it's going to see the light normally. But now let's go in a situation where you have a fluorescent light, like an old office fluorescent. You know, you go into the office building and they got those nasty green tubes up there and it's horrible. Those light sources are a discontinuous light source. They actually fluctuate in brightness up and down in line with the power signal. In America, we have 60 hertz power. In Europe and PAL territories, they have 50 hertz power. So that means 50 times a second, this light will create this cycle of going from light to dark. If the chip is scanning at about that rate, then on some lines that it scans, the light will be up here. On some lines it scans, the light will be over here. On some lights it scans, the light will be down here. What happens is you get a fluctuating brightness all over your image. The visibility of the bars depends on your shutter speed. Now, not all fluorescent lights are going to do this. There are some fluorescent lights that are designed for movie use, and they have a very high frequency electronic ballast, and even some of the newer shop lights have electronic ballast that run at a high frequency. And so instead of going 60 times a second, they might go 100,000 times a second. They're so fast, the chip, as it scans down, it will always see a continuous overall level of light, and so you won't see the bars. So if you have a high quality, high frequency, fluorescent or HMI type of light that's made specifically for the movie industry, you're probably not going to have a problem. If you have a magnetic ballast, older style HMI or fluorescent, you're going to have this problem. It is going to exist. You have to watch out for it and you have to avoid it. How do you watch out for it? Well, with the fluorescents and with the HMIs, also with the sodium vapor lights that you'll find street lights and stadium lights, there's mercury vapor and sodium vapor lights that you're going to find out there. Those are ballasted light sources too, and they're going to cause the problem too. So what you have to do is you have to be aware that this can happen, and you have to match your shutter speed to the power frequency of where you're shooting. Usually, in America, that's going to mean 1/60th of a second. And that's why I tell people, unless you know exactly what you're doing, set your shutter speed on 1/60th and never, ever, ever change it, because otherwise you're going to get hit with these bars. Now, how do you know when the bars are going to affect you? On those type of light sources, on fluorescents or HMIs or sodium vapor or mercury vapor lights, an easy way to tell is to set your shutter speed really, really high. Set it to like 1/250th of a second. And you will get these thick, horrible orange and black bars all over your image. If you see them at 1/250th or 1/500th, then you will also see them at 1/50th or 1/36th or whatever odd shutter speed you choose. And if you don't see them, if the image is pristine and clear at 1/250th, then that means you're safe to use any shutter speed. For those of you who are used to working in film and you know that we had something called HMI safe speeds, HMI safe filming speeds, that is not the case with an MOS camcorder. There is no such thing as an HMI safe filming speed. It will happen at 24 frames a second. It will happen at 60 frames a second. It will happen at 38 frames a second. It will happen at any frame rate. But there are HMI safe shutter speeds. And those shutter speeds are going to be divisors of your line frequency. So 1/60th of a second is safe. 1/40th of a second is also safe. 1/24th of a second is safe. 1/30th of a second is safe. In PAL territories, 1/50th and 1/25th. Those are your scrolling band safe speeds. There is another type of light, though, that is just going to bite you no matter what. You got to be aware of this. These are becoming hugely popular. Let me open this up. LED lighting. All the buzz is about LEDs and cheap LEDs, and these are cheap. I mean, I got these off eBay. I think this one was $50, this was $60. Battery powered, they'll run for 5 or 6 hours. They're daylight colored. I mean, really they are great, except for one thing, and that is the capability to dim the LED. If you dim an LED light, it's very likely that you will encounter the rolling band syndrome. Not all LED lights will do it, but when they do, using 1/60th of the shutter will not save you. The only thing you can do is adjust the brightness of the light so that it stops scrolling on you. There are multiple ways that dimming happens, and I've got 2 examples here. This particular one uses a discrete digital stepping dimmer. So it's about, I don't know, 16 steps. So you push the button all the way up to 100% brightness, and then you press the down button and it drops in brightness just a little bit, but it does so in discrete steps. This light, I don't want to badmouth it, but I'm going to let you know which particular one that I'm encountering. This is a Yongnuo YN160. It's a great light, but when it dims, an MOS camcorder is going to see the bars. And there are certain shutter speeds that you can chase the bars. I mean, if you really have to have the light at exactly the right level, you can try to chase it with a shutter speed, but it might take 1/400th of a second in order to make the bars go away. And that's not really practical to shoot with. When I use this light, I don't dim it at all. I leave it at 100% at all times. This one, on the other hand, it's not as bright of an output. It's not as many LEDs. This is called the 126 LED light. This is a CN126. This uses an analog wheel for dimming. It still seems like it dims in discrete steps, but as you turn this wheel, there's no visible bars introduced. This one is safe. Also, the Z96 light that I've tested, if you're running it off of a good solid battery source, that one is safe to dim. Not all lights are, and it also depends on the battery source. If you're using AA batteries, it might start flickering as the batteries start to die. So you really have to be careful with especially inexpensive LED lights to make sure you don't get hit with the scrolling band syndrome. There's a school of thought that says that you should only ever film at 1/48th of a second. On a CCD camera, maybe. On a film camera, sure. On a CMOS camera, you're asking for trouble because 1/48th will create the band. They can be subtle. There might be a very subtle fluctuation or a rippling through your footage, but it's going to be there if you're using those certain types of lights that cause it. Beware of it, know about it, and the motion signature between 1/48th and 1/60th isn't very much. If you go with 1/60th, you're safe. So 1/60th, unless you know exactly what you're doing. If you know exactly what you're doing, you can get away with 1/48th.